You might think that all steels are about the same in terms of their strength, but you would be wrong. Much of the cheap steel coming out of the booming Chinese steel sector has high levels of the chemical boron. The Chinese government pays steelmakers to add it to Chinese steel through a tax incentive. Boron makes the steel hard and brittle when it's welded, and there's now mounting evidence here in Australia that some structures are having their weak welding jobs just painted over rather than repaired and reworked, leave ticking time bombs all over the country due to weak and poor welds. Now, Geoff Crittenden is the Chief Executive of the Welding Institute of Australia, and he's joining us in a moment from the National Conference in Sydney of the Welding Technology Institute of Australia. And I've also got on the line Senator Xenophon, who spoke to the conference and is also planning legislation to impose a maximum boron level in steel coming into the country that is used for welding and fabrication. But of course, boron steel is not the only thing holding back Australia's steel sector. More than 100 years old, of course. Because the Senator plans to push for government procurement that recognises the economic, taxation and other positive benefits of local procurement. Now, guess what? Guess what? Both major parties in Canberra don't want to do it. But we were told all these trade agreements are jobs. Aren't they? Isn't that what we were told? Jobs? Let's talk to the CEO of the Welding Technology Institute, Geoff Crittenden. Geoff, tell the people of SA, good morning, what the issue is here.
The real issue is that we are getting two issues, really. Firstly, we're importing cheap, foreign-made fabricated steel products which don't comply to Australian standards. And we're finding bridges and play equipment and all sorts of things falling apart. The second thing is that we're importing high boron steel from particularly China. And the problem with high boron steel is that when you weld it, it creates all sorts of problems with the mechanical properties. So 6 or 12 months down the track, you can get cracking and things can start to fall apart.
If this does not meet the Australian standard, excuse my naivety and those of many listening, why are we letting it in?
That's an exceptionally good question, Leon, because Australian standards aren't regulated. They're voluntary standards. And the products coming in aren't inspected properly, and they come in, and there's nothing we can do about it at the moment.
So what happens if, you talked about play equipment, let's bring it right home to our front door. We're going to buy a swing for our kids for Christmas, and it's got this suspect steel, and God forbid it collapses, and the child is injured. Who's culpable?
That's a very good question, Leon. I'm not a lawyer.
Well, no.
But I would say the people that are culpable are the people that have manufactured the swing.
Yeah.
They have a duty of care to the people that buy it.
Now, in buildings, though, you know, we have a lot of apartments being built. It is quite likely that some of this steel is being used in those contingencies. What's the deal there?
Well, it's exactly the same problem with buildings, with bridges. The issue is that what happens is that normally an engineer or someone from the public will spot that there's a problem. There is no proper regulatory framework for safety in buildings and steel structures in this country.
Well, okay. Here's the dummy question. Well, why should we worry now if things don't seem to have gone awry already? What's happened? What's changed?
I guess it's like playing roulette, Leon. You know, you can lose an awful lot of time and then something will happen and you'll win. And it's the same here. You know, 9 times out of 10, an engineer or a fabricator will solve the problem and pick it up, nothing will happen. But there's a lot of ticking time bombs out there, and I'm talking thousands of ticking time bombs.
So if you're a builder and you want to use the right material, you got to be sure you source it, because you might assume that those selling it are selling it to you in the belief that it's of a standard of safety.
Leon, you're absolutely right, and this is one of the biggest issues with the steel industry at the moment. The only steel that you can guarantee is the correct quality is steel made in Australia. Other steel coming in, we've had issues with no material data sheets. That's the thing that tells you what the chemical composition is. And quite often we've had material data sheets fraudulently put together. So the company that manufactures the steel just writes a data sheet to meet what they think is the specification. And when it's tested, it doesn't meet the specification.
And there's another issue here. This stuff is undercutting the local steel, which is putting pressure on our steel makers.
Absolutely right. I mean, it's easy to sell steel that doesn't comply and make it cheaper, but there is a long-term maintenance and safety issue with it.
Where do you guys go from here? You've obviously spoken to the government about this. What do they say?
Well, actually, we're by and large, the government don't think it's an issue, but that's why we're so fortunate to have Senator Xenophon, who's taken up this.
If what you're telling us today is true, how could it not be an issue?
Perhaps you shouldn't ask me that, Leon. Perhaps you should ask the government.
So what are you saying here, in effect? If we don't do anything and keep doing what we're doing, what are you telling us?
If we don't keep doing what we're doing, there's a couple of things that's going to happen. Firstly, there won't be a steel industry in Australia. We won't have the facility to make things out of steel. It'll all be imported. And then we'll lose complete control over the quality of products made in this country. And the second thing, we're going to have accidents. I mean, Senator Xenophon spoke this morning about the issue with wire in housing, with poor quality imported cable, electrical
That's
cable.
the stuff that the ACCC have said, please get it checked, yeah.
And we've got exactly the same problem with steel, and something needs to be done. And Senator Xenophon is going to take up the fight for us, or with us.
Geoff Crittenden, thank you. That's the Welding Institute of Australia. Can you believe what you're hearing? Can you believe this? Nick Xenophon, good morning.
Good morning, Leon. It just gets from bad to worse. Look, what these people have to do all these major infrastructure projects. They can't compete against the imported stuff. There's information about some of these ticking time bombs could be pedestrian bridges made of steel where the welding is suspect, where it doesn't meet Australian standards. If it's a pedestrian bridge, involving kids at a school or something like that, you can imagine the consequences of something going wrong there. But it's also costing jobs. And other countries, and I was stopped after I spoke at this conference in Sydney by some people saying that, when they go to the States, when they go to Europe, people just laugh at us. They cannot believe we have such a lax approach both to standards and also to Australian manufacturing.
Why does the government say it's not an issue?
Look, you can't sheet the blame home to just this government. Successive governments and the bureaucracy have got this entrenched mentality that, you're going to get best so-called value for money, and that involves getting stuff from imported.
Yeah, but hang on.
But
we either have an Australian standard or we don't.
That's right. But it isn't a level playing field, because what is happening right now, is that people aren't able to compete fairly because the standards that apply to Australian steel fabricators with all the inspection requirements and the like don't apply to those coming from overseas invariably. And we've heard today from Geoff and from others that sometimes when it appears to be complying with the Australian standards, it's been fabricated. So the irony is that we've got fabricated steel with fabricated paperwork because there's been a fraud on consumers and on the Commonwealth of Australia in terms of standards not being complied with. So you need to change the laws. I'm working with Senator John Madigan from Victoria on this.
When you get support, if the government and the opposition don't think this is a problem, you can put up all the bills you like. They'll just look at you and say, go away.
Look, there's a beautiful thing called an election coming up in 12 months' time, and I genuinely want both sides to get on board with this. And by putting up the bill, by forcing an inquiry, we've got an inquiry into substandard building products. I'll just give you another example that might come home, and this will affect hundreds, if not thousands, of South Australians. There are 40,000 homes in this country with this defective infinity cable where the cable will degrade because of the composition of the plastic, the casing, the wires. It means 40,000 homes around the country, 24,000 in New South Wales. I dare say there'll be quite a few hundred, if not thousands, in South Australia. It poses a fire risk and a hazard risk, and so far there's only been the majority of that cabling still out there in the marketplace. So the cost of fixing it, because the company, as I understand it, has gone, is no longer around, will cost tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, we as taxpayers end up paying the cost for that. It's a false economy, this cheaper product, this cheaper stuff from overseas if it doesn't comply with standards.
Now, you had a conversation recently with Matthias Cormann, and you asked about procurement of local issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the government still doesn't acknowledge the benefit of the social and economic benefits of procuring something locally. There seems to be some reluctance to agree to that. They don't do the modelling on it. I asked in a question on notice, or an FOI request, I had to resort to an FOI request about what research has been done about the tax benefits of procuring locally, and the government said we have no material in relation to that. I mean, given that the Commonwealth has $40 billion a year, that's pretty much unbelievable.
But as I understand it, you were told that this might offend our free trade agreements, but aren't we being told that these are going to mean jobs?
One of the arguments given is that we can't have a Buy Australian First because it would offend our international obligations. When I said to Senator Cormann, what about legislation in the United States with whom we have signed a free trade agreement where there's Buy American Acts for defence for a whole range of products, including infrastructure, and even merchant ships in the United States, let alone naval ships, must be made in that country. The government basically said that they'll get back to me. They'll take it on notice. So when I asked which international agreements and what clause of an international agreement says we can't do this, it sort of reminds me a bit of your questions of former Prime Minister Rudd about the Copenhagen agreement years ago. The same thing. No one can seem to tell me which clause actually prevents us from doing this.
Well, America does it all the time.
Well, and what does that make us? We are the free trade Taliban. We take such a purist, literal view of the world while the rest of the world does us in the eye.
All right. Well, Nick, thanks for joining us.